in front of millions, what seemed like a harmless joke ignited a political firestorm. It happens in an instant. The crowd laughs, too loudly at first, nervously at second, and then a silence. It's the kind of moment you replay in your head over and over, wondering how everything can change so quickly. Pete Buttigieg stands at the podium, the soft blue light from the stage casting shadows across his face. His polished, confident smile never wavers. He's about to drop another one of his signature witty remarks. The crowd expects it. He always delivers with charm, always stays cool. His wit is a hallmark of his brand. Jasmine Crockett, seated a few feet away, listens quietly. Her eyes are focused, but the moment he speaks, the shift is palpable. The words spill out like a careless afterthought, a throwaway line meant to ease the tension. "Oh, don't worry, Jasmine. I'll save the complicated stuff for you," he quips, leaning slightly into the microphone, making the joke sound almost personal. The audience hesitates. A nervous laugh echoes from a few corners of the room, unsure of how to react. And then, it hits. The room falls into an uneasy silence. Jasmine's jaw tightens ever so slightly, her hands clasped in her lap. There's a flicker in her eyes, something between disbelief and the instinctual readiness of a fighter. The camera zooms in on her face. The growing tension is visible. The gasps start low and quick, but they grow louder, rippling outward like the first wave of a storm. Buttigieg's smile begins to fade, the warmth he thought he exuded now a thin veneer over a room that is rapidly becoming hostile. "Did he really just say that?" someone whispers from behind the camera. Within seconds, the social media storm explodes, tweets flooding in with hashtags, memes flying faster than the news could keep up. The news cycle shifts. His words, the ones he thought would smooth over an awkward moment, are now the thing everyone's talking about. No one can stop retweeting. "Is this the real Pete Buttigieg?" someone asks. Another replies, "Is this who we're following?" And the replies don't stop. Buttigieg looks around, searching the room for the approving nods he's accustomed to. All he finds are eyes, narrowed and critical. His arrogance, that sharp, calculating edge that has served him so well in the past, begins to crack. The backlash starts to build. Jasmine Crockett's calm, composed face, betraying nothing of the fury seeping through her, is already becoming the face of the moment. This is the start of something bigger, and it's only going to escalate. For Pete Buttigieg, it's a familiar, routine, witty remarks, sharp comebacks, and an effortless smile. For years, his ability to cut through tension with humor has been his signature, whether on the campaign trail, in debates, or at public events. His charm was always his shield, a finely crafted veneer of intelligence and calculated detachment. The jokes, while often tinged with a sense of superiority, were rarely called into question. They were the kind of quips that made the press smile, the kind of remarks that positioned him as the progressive voice of the future. But what Pete didn't account for, that fateful evening, was that some jokes are more than just words. They hold weight that can shift the very ground you stand on. And in the case of Jasmine Crockett, that weight was about to come crashing down. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, never played by those rules. She wasn't about clever, one-liners or hidden barbs. Her power lay in her ability to cut through the noise with a calm, steady presence. As a rising star in Congress, her reputation was one of dignity, truth, and unflinching resilience. When she spoke, people listened, not because she always had the sharpest zingers, but because her words carried conviction. The truth was her weapon, and she wielded it like a sword. There was no room for pretension or false humility in her world. In a political landscape rife with posturing, Crockett's no-nonsense approach stood out. She didn't need to pander to the cameras or rely on empty jokes. Her authenticity spoke for itself. The clash between Buttigieg's quick wit and Crockett's grounded sincerity had been building for months. For him, her rise in political circles was a constant reminder of the growing presence of voices that couldn't be silenced by slick words or shallow promises. For her, Buttigieg embodied everything that was wrong with the establishment, cynicism wrapped in charm. He was everything she had come to oppose. Polished, privileged, and too comfortable in his status. What Pete didn't realize was that, for Crockett, this moment wasn't about a joke. It was about something much larger. It was about the respect that was so often denied to people like her. The marginalized, the ignored, the voices that had spent years being pushed aside by smooth-talking politicians who thought they could buy their way to power with nothing but words. In that moment, when Buttigieg belittled her, he wasn't just insulting her. He was insulting everything she stood for, and, by extension, everything the people who voted for her stood for. This wasn't just a joke. It was a test, and it was a test that could define their futures. For Buttigieg, it could be a small bump in the road, or the moment that defined him as out of touch with the struggles of everyday Americans. For Crockett, it could be the spark that lit the fire of her political rise, or the day she learned that even the most dignified voices can't always control the narrative. But what happened next? It wasn't just a reaction to a joke. It was the beginning of a battle for something deeper, a battle for respect, for identity, for the power to define what was acceptable in public discourse. For Buttigieg, it would either solidify his place as a rising star or expose the cracks in his carefully crafted image. For Crockett, this moment would either be her finest hour or just another instance of being underestimated. What happens next changes everything. Pete Buttigieg didn't rise to political prominence by accident. He didn't come from the trenches, fighting his way up from humble beginnings. No, Buttigieg's ascent was one of sheer intellect, polished charm, and an understanding of the game that few could rival. Born in the comfort of academic circles, raised with the privilege of access and education, Buttigieg always had an edge. He excelled in every room he entered, from Harvard University to the Rhodes Scholarship. He was always the smartest person in the room, or at least he made sure it seemed that way. His political career began as an earnest attempt to change things, a young, ambitious mayor of South Bend, Indiana, seeking to modernize a Rust Belt town on the brink of collapse. At first, he was a progressive dreamer. His appeal was undeniable. A young, articulate, openly gay politician with big ideas and an even bigger vision for America. He tapped into a sense of hope, embodying the kind of intellectual elitism that resonated with the media and the educated classes. His calm demeanor, paired with his sharp wit, was irresistible to the pundits. He was everything the modern progressive movement was supposed to be, fresh, polished, and smarter than everyone else. But it was that very sharpness, his ability to slice through conversations with cutting remarks and sharp one-liners, that would come back to haunt him. Buttigieg's charm was always grounded in his ability to be clever, quick-witted, and above all, superior. He had a way with words that made him the darling of the media. His style was effortless, his rhetoric smooth, with just enough sarcasm to disarm anyone who dared challenge him. But underneath that surface, something was beginning to shift. His cleverness had evolved into a type of condescension, one that was harder to mask, especially in the hypersensitive political climate that had emerged. The cracks started to show in the 2020 primaries. He was never afraid to poke fun at his opponents, whether it was his constant jabs at Bernie Sanders' age, his subtle mockery of Elizabeth Warren's plans, or his attempts to position himself as the only true candidate for the future. In one of the debates, he remarked about how certain candidates just didn't understand the importance of pragmatic solutions, an obvious dig at Sanders. His tone was always light-hearted, even playful, but the message was clear. If you didn't agree with Pete Buttigieg, you were living in the past. And then there was his famous quip about voters in rural America. They don't care about infrastructure or healthcare. They care about being respected, he said during a campaign stop in Iowa. To some, it was an insightful commentary on the alienation felt by many working-class voters. But to others, it felt like a dismissal, a patronizing comment that ignored the very real struggles that people in these communities were facing. The comment didn't land with the same audience that had once adored him. His message, once wrapped in empathy, now felt more like an insult. Buttigieg's condescension wasn't limited to his opponents or voters from rural areas. He would often refer to his experience as the mayor of South Bend as a big city job in a small city. To the voters who had supported him in his rise to prominence, that statement felt like a dismissal of the very struggles that many of them had lived through. It was as if his quick wit and clever repartee were more important than understanding the reality of those who didn't live in bubble-like cities or attend Ivy League universities. Buttigieg had crafted an image of the intellectual, a champion of urban, highly educated progressives. But in doing so, he had distanced himself from the working class and marginalized groups that had helped elevate him. In a particularly controversial moment, Buttigieg made a joke about the struggle of being a millennial while on a stage full of middle-aged and older voters. It was a line that was supposed to be funny, self-deprecating even, but it fell flat. The audience was not amused. For many, it wasn't just a bad joke. It was the kind of remark that exposed Buttigieg's complete detachment from the struggles of ordinary people. The disconnection was palpable. He was now the voice of the elite, a politician who had spent so much time on the campaign trail and in exclusive circles that he had lost touch with the very people he was supposed to represent. By the time Buttigieg's campaign fizzled out, his reputation had become one of intellectualism wrapped in arrogance. He was seen as the well-spoken, brilliant mind who could offer the perfect solution for any problem, except, as it turned out, the problem of connecting with real everyday people. His rise was built on the idea that he was above the noise, above the people, above the messiness of politics. But now, as he stood in front of millions, cracking jokes with the kind of condescension that had alienated so many, that image was beginning to unravel. What the world didn't see, what most failed to understand, was that Buttigieg's sharp wit wasn't just a weapon, it was a shield he used to hide the growing cracks in his armor. The insecurity of knowing that no matter how many degrees he had or how well-spoken he was, there were people who would always see through it. And on that stage, with millions watching, that shield was beginning to shatter. But beneath that confident smile, something was about to crack. Jasmine Crockett's rise in politics was not a story of privilege or luck. It was a story of grit. Born in the heart of Dallas, Texas, she grew up in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities were limited, but determination was not. Her parents, immigrants who worked 2 jobs to support their family, taught her that every challenge could be overcome with hard work and an unshakable belief in justice. But those lessons weren't just about doing the right thing. They were about fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. From a young age, Jasmine understood the weight of adversity. Her mother, a seamstress, often worked late into the night, stitching together garments to make ends meet. Her father, a factory worker, spent long hours on the assembly line, sometimes missing family dinners just to put food on the table. They instilled in her the belief that anyone, no matter their background, could rise to the occasion if they were willing to put in the work. It was this work ethic, this unyielding resilience, that would become her foundation as she navigated the brutal world of politics. She didn't enter politics out of ambition alone. For Jasmine, politics was a calling, a way to make the kind of change she had seen so many people in her community desperately need. From her early years as an advocate for justice, she was driven by a singular purpose: to elevate the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. Whether it was organizing protests against police brutality, fighting for affordable healthcare, or demanding fair wages for working-class families, Jasmine was always on the front lines. She was the voice in the room that wasn't afraid to speak up, even when everyone else was too scared or too comfortable to do so. Her first major political win came when she was elected to the Texas House of Representatives at the age of 38. She had already earned a reputation as a fierce advocate for racial justice, and the fact that she was a black woman in a state that had long been a stronghold of conservative politics only fueled her determination. She faced down opposition at every turn, from the entrenched power brokers in her district to the more seasoned politicians who saw her as a threat. But she wasn't intimidated. She knew that the people she represented had been left behind for too long. She was their voice, their chance for something better. And yet, the road wasn't always easy. There were the whispered criticisms of her radical ideas, the undercurrents of doubt about her ability to play the game in a system built on compromise and corporate funding. She faced mockery from those who didn't think a woman like her belonged in the halls of power. But instead of retreating, Jasmine leaned in. She dug her heels in and demanded to be heard. Her courage was not born out of arrogance, but from an unshakable sense of duty. She knew that the stakes were higher than any one moment, any one insult. For Jasmine, politics was about the long game. It was about the legacy she wanted to leave for her community, her country, and her children. What made her stand out even more was her authenticity. While others played the political game, wearing their polished smiles and perfected rhetoric, Jasmine didn't bend. She didn't come from money, didn't have the same Ivy League credentials as the other politicians. She wasn't interested in playing the part. She was interested in the work, the hard work that made a difference in people's lives. When she spoke from the heart. And that was something her opponents could never quite figure out. They didn't know how to handle someone who wasn't afraid to speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. Her rise was punctuated by moments that showed her true character. When a controversial police shooting shook her district, Jasmine was one of the first to show up. Not with a prepared statement, but with a real raw message to the community. She didn't talk about politics. She talked about the pain of losing someone too young, the fear that comes with being black in America, and the responsibility to fight back against systemic injustice. Her authenticity turned her into a political force. And soon, she was regarded as a leader, not just in her district, but across the state. But it wasn't just her record as an advocate that earned her respect. It was her ability to stay calm in the face of adversity. While others would have buckled under pressure, Jasmine remained poised. She had been through enough hardship to know that the world wasn't kind to people who didn't fight for themselves. Whether she was facing down hostile political forces, weathering personal attacks, or dealing with the day-to-day challenges of being a black woman in politics, she did so with the same quiet dignity she had learned from her parents. And it wasn't just about maintaining her composure, it was about using her platform to teach others how to do the same. This was the essence of Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't some politician looking to climb the ladder. She was a woman who had been forged in the fires of struggle, someone who knew that the path to progress wasn't always easy or pretty. It was messy, it was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. The moment with Pete Buttigieg wasn't just another confrontation. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for. It was the moment when all the years of standing up, speaking out, and fighting for justice would either pay off or be swept away. She could feel it in her bones. This was the test. A test of everything she had built, everything she had fought for. And Jasmine Crockett was ready to face it head on. The room had already shifted. The joke, once light-hearted, had been the spark to a fire that was now beginning to rage. Pete Buttigieg, his self-assured smile already faltering, glanced at Jasmine Crockett, whose expression was unreadable. The audience held its breath, waiting for her response. Some were still chuckling nervously, unsure of how to handle what had just transpired. Others, however, were watching Crockett intently, waiting for her to speak. They knew this was the moment when everything could change. Crockett took a long breath. The sting of Buttigieg's words still echoed in her mind, but she refused to let it show. She had faced worse in her life, far worse. And this wasn't going to be the thing that broke her. Not now. Not in front of the cameras. With calm precision, she turned toward him. The silence in the room was deafening. Her voice, when it came, was steady, sharp, and laced with the kind of poise that demanded respect. "Is that the best you've got, Pete?" she asked. her words cutting through the air like a blade. There was no anger in her tone, only a quiet confidence that made the room sit up straighter. She didn't need to raise her voice to command. Attention. She had already done that. Buttigieg's smile wavered for just a moment, and for a split second, the mask of self-assurance slipped. The charm, the calculated wit, all of it seemed less powerful now. He quickly recovered, straightening his posture and leaning into the mic with that familiar grin. "Oh, come on, Jasmine. I was just trying to lighten the mood," he replied, his voice dripping with that practiced, condescending warmth. "I know politics can get a little heavy sometimes. A little humor never hurt anyone, right?" The audience's reaction was immediate, a mix of uncomfortable chuckles and murmurs, but there was no mistaking the tension that had begun to bubble beneath the surface. The playful banter Buttigieg relied on was no longer working. His deflection wasn't as smooth as it used to be, and the crowd wasn't buying it. Crockett didn't flinch. She wasn't in the mood for games. "I'm sure you think it's all fun and games," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But here's the thing, Pete. You can't joke your way out of everything. Not when your jokes come at the expense of people who have had to fight their entire lives to be seen as equal. Not when your humor is just another way to make others feel small." There was a beat of silence before her words hit. The room shifted again. This time, it wasn't just about the joke, it was about something bigger. Some in the audience shifted in their seats, nodding slightly, feeling the weight of what she said. It was as though she had flipped a switch. What had started as a light-hearted exchange was now a stark confrontation over power, respect, and privilege. Buttigieg didn't seem to know how to react at first. The room had gone from laughter to uneasy quiet, and for the first time, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. He was used to being the one to set the tone, to steer the conversation in the direction he wanted. But here, in this moment, the spotlight was squarely on Crockett. Her words had landed, and the audience felt it. Trying to regain control, Buttigieg quickly leaned back in, his voice laced with forced humor. Okay, Jasmine. I see you're not a fan of my stand-up routine," he said, waving his hand, dismissively. "But maybe we can get back to the issues now." The audience didn't respond with the same easy laughter this time. A few muttered under their breath. A few exchanged looks. There was an edge to their reaction, a sign that the room was beginning to split. Some still found Buttigieg's charm amusing, even in the face of such a pointed criticism. But others, many others, were starting to side with Crockett. They were seeing her for what she was, a woman who wouldn't let herself be reduced to a punchline. Crockett wasn't about to let this slip away. She had fought too hard to be taken seriously, too hard to be dismissed like this. She wasn't going to let Buttigieg use his smug smile to avoid accountability. Her response was quick, but cutting, the words a razor's edge. "It's not about your jokes, Pete," she said, her voice steady, but heavy with meaning. "It's about your refusal to acknowledge that some of us have to work 10 times harder, just to be heard. You think a clever quip is enough to make us forget that? You think we're all just here for a laugh? Well, I'm not. And neither are the millions of people you've been laughing at." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at his feet. The crowd shifted again. This wasn't just a debate anymore. This wasn't about who could make the other laugh or look clever. This was about who had the real power to stand their ground. Who had the conviction to speak their truth, regardless of the consequences. Buttigieg's smile was gone now, replaced by something far less certain. His eyes darted around the room, looking for support. But the words, Crockett, had spoken had planted a seed of doubt. He had underestimated her. And now it was clear. The ease he had once taken for granted was no longer his to command. The room was divided, the tension palpable. Some were still amused by his attempts to deflect. Others were mesmerized by Crockett's unwavering resolve. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just about a joke anymore. It was about respect, about power, and who could hold their ground. Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, her presence commanding the room. The laughter and murmur of the audience had settled into a tense silence, hanging in the air like smoke. The stage, once filled with light-hearted banter, was now a battleground, and the battle lines had been drawn. Pete Buttigieg stood a few feet away, his usual confidence replaced by an increasingly tight-lipped smile. His sharp wit, once his greatest strength, had failed him. And now, Crockett was about to deliver the response that would change everything. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. There was no rush. She had all the time she needed to make her point. Her gaze never left Buttigieg as she spoke, each word deliberate, calculated, yet delivered with the kind of calm that could pierce through the noise and hit to the heart of the matter. "I get it, Pete," she began, her voice calm but edged with the sharpness of truth. "You're used to being the smartest person in the room. You're used to people laughing along, nodding at every clever remark. You've made a career of it, haven't you? Making fun of people who aren't in your circle, belittling anyone who doesn't fit into your idea of progress. You joke about the very people you claim to represent." There was no immediate response from Buttigieg, just the subtle shift of his stance, the way his eyes narrowed slightly. He knew where this was going, and he didn't like it. But Crockett wasn't done. She wasn't finished exposing the cracks in the polished image he'd spent years constructing. She paused for a moment, letting her words settle. The crowd waited, anticipating what would come next. And Crockett, ever the strategist, used the silence to her advantage. She let the weight of her words sink in before she continued. "You say you're the voice of progress," she went on, "but you're nothing more than an actor on a stage, performing for an audience that already believes in your story. You talk about change, about equality, about fighting for the people, but what have you really done, Pete? You've used your privilege to climb the ladder, and now you think your jokes will make the people you've ignored feel better, like you're one of us." The room was tense. A few people shifted in their seats. Some gasped, others nodded in agreement. But Buttigieg remained silent, the walls he'd built around himself now seeming to close in. His smile had faltered, completely, replaced by the kind of defensive posture that was rarely seen in public. He looked like a man trying to maintain control, while everything around him slipped through his fingers. "I'm not just here to talk about your jokes, Pete," Crockett continued, her voice growing more powerful. "I'm here to talk about the system you represent. The one that dismisses people like me, people like so many of those watching tonight, as too radical, too angry, or too emotional. You've made a name for yourself by being the cool, collected intellectual, the one who can dish out witty remarks, but never has to face the consequences of your words. You've never had to fight like we have. You've never had to fight for your dignity." She let the words hang in the air, letting them simmer. The audience was with her now. They could feel it. This wasn't just a political debate anymore. This was about something far deeper, something personal. Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was defending the people who had been overlooked for far too long, the ones who had been laughed at, belittled, or ignored by the very system Buttigieg claimed to champion. "You call yourself progressive," she said, her tone steady but with a growing intensity. "But true progress doesn't come from the top down. It comes from the bottom up, from the people who are on the streets, in the factories, in the hospitals, fighting for their lives every single day. Progress isn't about making people feel comfortable in their privilege. It's about confronting the uncomfortable truths that make the powerful uncomfortable." The crowd reacted, first with silence, then with a low murmur of agreement. Eyes were widening, and people were starting to shift in their seats, leaning forward as if they could feel the energy in the room change. Buttigieg's defensiveness was palpable now. His fingers fidgeted slightly at his sides, and his gaze flicked to the crowd, as though he was searching for a lifeline. But Crockett wasn't done. She wasn't finished exposing the hypocrisy she saw in front of her. With a steady breath, she hit him with the final blow. "You're not a hero of the people, Pete. You're a product of the system, and that's exactly why your joke fell flat. You thought you could laugh it off. You thought you could make us the punchline. But I'm not here to be your joke, and neither are the millions of people who've been forgotten by the very people who claim to have the answers." For a moment, There was nothing but silence. No one in the room dared to speak. It was as though the air itself had thickened, holding its breath. Then, a slow, cautious applause began. At first, it was just a few scattered claps, timid, unsure, but then, like a wave, it spread through the room, louder, stronger, until the applause was deafening, echoing off the walls, a tidal wave of support for Crockett's words. But Buttigieg stood there, his face a mask of disbelief. He wasn't used to this. The applause wasn't for him. It was for her. His face told the story. He had underestimated his opponent. For the first time that evening, it was clear that the political battlefield had shifted. The power dynamic had changed. The audience had been won over by Crockett's calm, dignified truth. And Buttigieg, once the darling of the media, was now a man on the defensive, watching as the narrative slipped from his grasp. As the applause surged, the reality set in. Pete Buttigieg's carefully crafted image, his wit, his charm, his air of invincibility, wasn't enough, not anymore. The room had spoken, and in that moment, it was clear that the stakes were higher than ever. The ripple effects of Jasmine Crockett's response were immediate and explosive. Within minutes of her mic drop counterattack, social media erupted. It started with the hashtag #Buttigieg, which quickly gained traction and became the most trending topic across platforms. Thousands of tweets flooded in, each more outraged and supportive than the last. Memes circulated at lightning speed. One showed a stoic Crockett standing tall with the caption, "When you've got the truth and a mic, Pete's jokes don't stand a chance." Another showed a split screen. On one side, Buttigieg's flustered face, and on the other, Crockett calmly leaning into her rebuttal with the text, "The people's mic, 1, politician's ego, 0. The internet wasn't just buzzing, it was on fire. Commentators and pundits, who had previously dismissed Crockett as just another progressive voice, now scrambled to recalibrate. Headlines flooded the web, each one more dramatic than the last. Crockett takes down Buttigieg in stunning debate. Moment. Jasmine Crockett dismantles Buttigieg's progressive image in one speech. And has Pete Buttigieg finally met his match? For the first time in a long while, the narrative around Buttigieg was shifting. His political armor, once seen as impenetrable, now looked more like a rusted shell. The youthful, polished, smart guy image that had made him a darling of the establishment media began to feel hollow, exposed for all to see. His social media following, once brimming with adoration, now saw a notable decline. His posts, once receiving thousands of likes and retweets, now languished, buried beneath the avalanche of Crockett's post-speech praise. But while the internet buzzed with controversy and support for Crockett, the true power of the moment was seen in the endorsements that began to pour in. Celebrities who had once been hesitant to take sides now made their voices heard. A tweet from actor and activist Kerry Washington quickly garnered over 1 million likes. The truth always comes through. Jasmine Crockett, you've made us all proud. Crockett owns Buttigieg. Her tweet was shared widely, and soon others followed. Actresses, musicians, and influencers from across the political spectrum joined the chorus of support for Crockett. Hollywood wasn't the only place where Crockett gained ground. Political figures who had remained quiet during the earlier stages of the debate began to rally behind her. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what leadership looks like, not jokes, but dignity. Jasmine Crockett, young Crockettowns Buttigieg." Within hours, more progressive voices in Congress echoed her sentiments, praising Crockett for exposing the cracks in Buttigieg's facade. What was once considered a personal spat had quickly become a symbol of the larger political struggle, one between the establishment elite and the new wave of leaders who would no longer tolerate their games. In stark contrast, Buttigieg's support dwindled. His campaign's press secretary scrambled to manage the fallout. Official statements, designed to downplay the event and pivot back to his policy proposals, fell flat. His words sounded like excuses, like an attempt to reclaim control over a narrative he no longer owned. Instead of galvanizing his base, he seemed to alienate them further, especially as commentators questioned whether his intellectual charm had turned into nothing more than elitist condescension. Political commentators from both sides of the aisle were quick to point out the significance of Crockett's move. Former GOP strategist Steve Schmidt wrote, "Jasmine Crockett has done what few could. She's shattered the myth of Pete Buttigieg's unassailable political persona." Her words weren't just a takedown. They were a dismantling of the very myth the Democratic establishment had built around him. Even conservative voices, who had long criticized Buttigieg for his polished, technocratic style, couldn't help but praise Crockett's directness and moral clarity. But it wasn't just about words anymore. The symbolic divide between Buttigieg and Crockett had grown so stark that even the public's perception of what it meant to be a leader began to change. While Buttigieg's career had been built on progressive ideas, he was now being painted as an elitist who had forgotten where he came from and who he was supposed to represent. On the other hand, Crockett's words echoed with authenticity, with a grounded understanding of what real people in America were facing. She had reframed the debate not as one of policy or personality, but of power, respect, and who could truly speak for the people. As the hours turned into days, the political landscape began to shift. The rift between Buttigieg's brand of intellectual elitism and Crockett's brand of grassroots authenticity became a defining issue. In the wake of Crockett's response, grassroots fundraising for her skyrocketed, with millions pouring into her campaign coffers from small donors who saw her as the political change they had been waiting for. At the same time, Buttigieg's fundraising began to stall as donors hesitated to continue backing a man whose credibility had been so publicly called into question. The media narrative continued to swirl, but the central question remained. Could Buttigieg recover? Could he regain the momentum he had once had? Or was this the beginning of the end of his political career? In the days following the debate, the political establishment began to ask itself one crucial question. Was this moment just a fluke? Or had the political landscape shifted permanently, but the battle wasn't over yet? The political game was never simple, and in this new charged atmosphere, there were bigger stakes to consider. What happened next? The next debate, the next move, the next public appearance would determine not just the future of these two politicians, but the future of a political system that had been rocked to its core. What happened next would change the political game forever. The aftermath of that fateful debate, the viral moment that had reverberated across the nation, was not just about politics. It was about something much deeper. Jasmine Crockett's response wasn't simply a comeback to Pete Buttigieg's flippant joke. It was a full-throated challenge to the very values that had come to dominate the political landscape. In the days following the confrontation, the narratives began to shift. What was once a simple debate over a joke had turned into a cultural reckoning, and the moral of the story was clear for anyone paying attention. Dignity and authenticity, the courage to speak the truth and stand firm in the face of adversity, were far more powerful than arrogance and cheap humor. Crockett's victory wasn't simply political. It was a reflection of the values that had always been at the heart of this nation, the values that so many had forgotten in the pursuit of power, image, and quick wins. In that moment, Jasmine had reminded the country of the principles that truly mattered: truth, respect, and fairness. She had reframed the debate in such a way that it was no longer about who could tell the cleverest joke or deliver the most polished line. It was about who could stand tall in the face of disrespect, who could hold their ground when it seemed the world was trying to tear them down. Her words had resonated because they spoke to something universal. They spoke to every person who had ever been overlooked, belittled, or dismissed because they didn't fit the mold of what others expected them to be. Her victory was for them. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt small or unheard, every immigrant, every working-class American, every person who had fought for a place in this world and had been told they weren't enough. In Crockett's measured response, the nation saw the embodiment of a deeper truth, that the greatest strength lies not in tearing others down, but in standing firm in your own convictions and refusing to let anyone define your worth. Crockett's challenge was not just to Buttigieg or the political elite. It was to everyone who had ever been part of the system that had allowed these false narratives to persist. You can laugh, you can make jokes, you can belittle people, but in the end, it won't matter. What matters is whether you have the courage to be real, to be honest, and to stand for what's right when it's not convenient. She had turned. The tide, not with grand rhetoric or flashy promises, but with a quiet, powerful authenticity that left a lasting impression. In that moment, she embodied the spirit of America in its truest form. She wasn't trying to fit into a mold that had been created for her. She wasn't trying to appease anyone. She was simply being who she was, a voice of truth, a voice of dignity, a voice for those who had been too often silenced, and that, in the end, was what resonated with the American people. It wasn't the joke that had defined the moment. It was the way Crockett had reclaimed it, turned it into something greater, something that had meaning beyond the debate stage. Her victory wasn't just about one moment or one debate. It was about the way she had shifted the conversation, the way she had made it clear that people were tired of the games, tired of the empty promises and the hollow rhetoric, tired of leaders who thought they could get away with mockery and dismissiveness. Her speech had not only put Buttigieg on notice, it had put everyone on notice. The stakes of this battle were not just about winning a debate or scoring political points. They were about fighting for something much bigger. The fight for what's right. The fight for a political system that was built on respect, fairness, and a commitment to the people, not to self-serving egos. Crockett had stood tall in the face of adversity. And in doing so, she had become a symbol of something more powerful than any politician's joke or media spectacle. She had become a beacon of what it meant to stand for truth in a world that often values image over integrity. And in the end, it wasn't about the joke. It wasn't about the moment that ignited the political firestorm. It was about the larger fight that was taking place, not just in politics, but in society. The fight for authenticity, for dignity, and for respect. The fight to push back against those who seek to tear others down with arrogance and humor at their expense. As the applause from that historic night continued to echo in the halls of politics, it became clear that Jasmine Crockett wasn't just an up-and-coming politician. She was a force to be reckoned with, a reminder that no matter how many jokes you tell, no matter how polished or witty you are, it's the ones who stand firm, who speak the truth, and who fight for the right thing that will always emerge victorious. In the end, it wasn't about the joke, it was about the fight for what's right. The lesson is clear. Dignity and respect will always triumph over arrogance and mockery, no matter how many times the powerful try to belittle the voices of those they deem lesser. It is the unwavering strength of truth, the courage to stand tall in the face of adversity, that will always win in the end. Jasmine Crockett's victory wasn't just a political one. It was a victory for every person who has ever been told they don't belong, for every voice that has been silenced, for every person who has fought to be seen and heard. In the face of mockery, Crockett stood firm, and in doing so, she reminded us all that authenticity is more powerful than performance. She didn't just take down an opponent, she showed the world what it looks like when you fight for what's right. So, what can we learn from this moment? It's simple. The fight for justice, respect, and dignity is not over. The system may try to tear us down, but when we stand together, when we speak the truth with clarity and conviction, there is nothing we can't change. Join the movement for truth. Share this story. Subscribe for more content that stands up for what's right. Together, we can make sure that moments like these are more than just fleeting headlines. They can be the catalyst for the change we all seek. Because sometimes, one moment of dignity can change everything.